Good morning. I'm back. If you caught my little mini video, I did the whole sermon earlier today, but then the live video hadn't started and the it was covered up, so I didn't notice it till I got to the end. But it's good to be back. I'm in my office today, and I had a good time preaching at our church, Canby Alliance Church, last week, and then this morning I went back over after I practiced my sermon, and our pastor candidate was there, and he gave the sermon this morning over there. And so you can pray for him and for our church to find out what God has in mind for us as far as our next pastor goes. Excuse me. And I was reading in the Psalms last week, and David says in Psalm 138:8, he says, "The Lord will work out his plans for my life." And that's reassuring because, for one thing, God has a plan for our lives. And for a second, he's going to work out that plan. And so that's a very reassuring. But it doesn't mean that everything's going to be peachy, because the Lord's plan might include some hard times and some suffering. And the hard times and the suffering might even be good for us. So, some of the most difficult situations I come across in my daily work, my paid job, are disputes between neighbors. And for the most part, I don't do litigation anymore. But I heard about a situation. I was tangentially informed about it, where one neighbor didn't like the fence between his property and the other neighbor's property. And well, it's a boundary line fence, and so it kind of belongs to both neighbors. But the first neighbor couldn't get the second neighbor to go along with what he wanted to do, and so he just tore down the fence. Naturally, the second neighbor got a lawyer involved because he couldn't get anywhere with the first neighbor. And so naturally, the first neighbor had to get his own lawyer, and litigation ensued over a fence. And there's a saying that goes, when there's only one lawyer in a town, he's going to starve. But when there are two, they will both get rich. And if you catch the drift of that. Well, in the end, the first neighbor had to pay to replace the fence, and he had to pay for his own attorney fees, and he had to pay for the other neighbor's attorney fees. And so it was a very costly lesson for the first neighbor. Now, he wasn't trying to be kind to the other neighbor, but sometimes, even when we're trying to be kind to someone, it ends up resulting in conflict. And so we need to know how to handle conflict in a godly way, because there can be consequences from the way that we proceed. And so today's story shows how sometimes we can win the earthly war, but we end up losing the spiritual battle. And the text for this is 2 Samuel chapter 10. And so last time in chapter 9, David showed kindness to Mephibosheth, and today he tries to do it again, but his attempt is misunderstood and mischaracterized, and so he has to prepare to go to war against the person that he wanted to show kindness to. And he ends up winning the battle, but the other side regroups, and then David has to go out and proactively confront them again. And he wins that battle too. But these incidents set him up for future problems. And the question is, what if David had found another way out? So 2 Samuel chapters 1 to 8 are very positive about David and record many of his successes and godly actions. And then 2 Samuel 9 to 20 are largely negative and they record many of David's failures and the consequences of his unrighteous actions. Now, 2 Samuel 9, the story of Mephibosheth, is very positive. Chuck Swindoll calls it the greatest illustration of grace in the Old Testament. But it sets up the reader for David's decline into unfaithfulness. And in particular, chapters 9 and 10 set up or frame the story of David's unfaithfulness, that is, adultery with Bathsheba, which is coming up in chapters 11 and 12. Then in later chapters, we'll see the consequences that result from David's unfaithfulness to God and to the covenants. Now, there's an obvious lesson in here for us. We can quickly go from being faithful, loyal followers of Jesus and decline into sin and immorality with the resulting consequences for us and others. If it can happen to someone like David, who was a man after God's own heart and filled with the Holy Spirit, it can happen to us if we're not careful to follow God's ways. And just in the last couple weeks, I've seen reports of at least two major pastors who had a falling away because they slipped into the sin of adultery. And then they had to pay the consequences. The church had to suffer the consequences, and the pastor's family had to suffer the consequences. So we need to be careful to follow God's ways. All right, back to our passage. In verses 1 to 5, David wants to show kindness to a king named Hanun after Hanun's father dies, and Hanun becomes king. But it doesn't go well. And so verses 1 to 5 say, now it happened afterward that the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun became king in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent some of his servants to console him about his father. But when David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites, the commander of the Ammonites said to their lord Hanun, do you think that David is simply honoring your father since he has sent you servants to console you? Has David not sent his servants to you in order to explore the city, to spy it out and overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half of their beards and cut off their robes in the middle as far as their buttocks and sent them away. When the messengers informed David, he sent servants to meet them because the men were extremely humiliated. And the king said, stay in Jericho until your beards grow back, and then you shall return. So this is very similar to chapter 9, where David showed kindness to Mephibosheth on account of Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan, and grandfather Saul, who was the king at the time, king of Israel. Hanun's father is probably the same Nahash who appears in 1 Samuel 11 and attacks Jabesh Gilead. And Saul leads the Israelites out to rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead. Later, the people of Jabesh Gilead rescue Saul and Jonathan's bodies from the Philistines and give them a proper burial. David says he's going to show kindness to Hanun on account of the kindness that Hanun's father Nahash had shown him. And we don't know what that was because it's not recorded. And so maybe there was an incident where Hanun or Nahash did something for David, or maybe they were just allies. We don't know. Well, it is, of course, a good thing to show kindness to people who have suffered loss. We don't here have any explicit mention that David consulted with God on this plan of his to show kindness to this foreigner. And so we might question his motives. Perhaps he was doing it for political reasons. Where his kindness to Mephibosheth was pure grace, his kindness to Hanun might be motivated by the benefit that David will receive back for it. And so it's not really grace if you're doing it so you can receive something back for it. So the first kind of inflection point in this story is the question of whether David should have sent messengers to show kindness to Hanun. And if he was not motivated by kindness, but by the personal benefit, maybe he shouldn't have done it in the first place. Or in a lot of previous examples, previous stories, David consulted with God before making a decision. And maybe he could have consulted with God before sending the messengers to Hanun. So when we try to be nice to other people, we should be prepared to have our motives questioned. The new king's commanders told him, well, David's men are not here to honor your father. They're here to spy out your city. And so they're preparing to attack and overthrow your city. And so the king, Hanun, did what any red-blooded Middle Eastern king would do. He shaved off half of the messengers' beards, and he cut off their robes in the middle and back so their buttocks were exposed, and then he sent them on their way. Well, this is quite humiliating for David's men. It would have been an unbearable shame for them to return to Jerusalem and be seen in this condition. And so somehow the messengers inform David, and he tells them, well, stay in Jericho until your beards grow back, and then you can return to Jerusalem and not suffer any more shame than you already have. So I don't know if you've ever tried to do something nice for someone and have them misinterpret it or have someone else mischaracterize it. So I do a lot of estate planning, and the children will sometimes try to help out their parents when the parents get older and they are less able to handle things on their own. And sometimes, most of the time, it's legitimate help, but other times it looks like they're trying to take advantage of the parent. And there are attorneys out there who will mischaracterize it as elder abuse and try to really stick it to the helpful child, usually at the instigation of another sibling. And so even though their motives are pure, this helpful child will end up being humiliated and financially ruined because their intent has been mischaracterized. And of course, sometimes the helpful child's motives are not pure, and they take advantage of the parent's trust to take control of the assets for their own benefit. And so first of all, we need to examine our own motives for why we are being nice to someone. And then second, we need to be prepared to have our motives questioned and plan for how we will respond to such situations. And so we got to make sure our motives are in fact pure, and then we should make a record of what we did and why we did it. And that way, when our motives are questioned, we can say, well, here's what I did and here's why I did it. Once when I was in leadership at a different church, decisions had been made in the past with no record of the decision or why it was made. And later on, the decision was questioned. People tend to honestly forget or misremember what decisions were made. And because there was no record, nobody could say for certain what the decision was. And so the motives of the people involved were called into question. So this group started keeping a written record of all big decisions and having everybody involved actually sign on the piece of paper. Well, in verses 6-8, the Ammonites realized that, they might have made a big mistake, but rather than seek peace with David, they decide to escalate the situation by preparing for war. And so it says there in 6-8, now when the sons of Ammon saw that they had become repulsive to David, they sent the sons of Ammon sent messengers and hired the Arameans of Beth Rehob and the Arameans of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tov with 12,000 men. When David heard about this, he sent Joab and all the army, the warriors, and the sons of Ammon came out and lined up for battle at the entrance of the city, while the Arameans of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were stationed by themselves in the field. So it says that the Ammonites saw that they had become repulsive to David. The word means to be made stinking, odious, to be hated. And, who could imagine after the way they treated those messengers that they would become repulsive to David? And so now they're anticipating that David's going to respond to the offense by going to war with them. So they go out and hire a bunch of mercenaries from Aramites, from Maacah and Tov, and it looks like a total of 33,000 extra soldiers. Now, these Arameans lived in what is modern-day Syria and western Iraq, so to the east of Israel, across the Jordan. David did the natural human response and sent his army to Hanun city. Then the Ammonites came out of the city and lined up for battle at the entrance to the city, but the mercenaries were stationed out somewhere else in a field. So the second inflection point here is whether David should have sent his army out to attack the Ammonites on account of their mistreatment of his messengers. And what Hanun did to the messengers was certainly humiliating, and in an honor-based culture like theirs, something just had to be done, or David might lose face. But it's interesting, in the past, there had been occasions where David could have done something and might have lost face for not doing it, but he chose not to do it. And so there's something a little different here in David's life based on how he responds here. But how often do we get ourselves in bad situations because we are afraid that we might lose face, lose respectability, be embarrassed? Well, the New Testament has some imperatives for such situations. In Matthew 5:43-44, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And then in Romans 12:17-21, Paul says, "Never repay evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all people. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And so in the Romans passage, there's a couple of Old Testament quotations. One from Deuteronomy 32:35. "The vengeance is mine, I will repay." That's from Deuteronomy. And the other is from Proverbs 25:21. And David would have had the Deuteronomy passage in his Bible, but perhaps not the Proverbs 25 passage, because his son Solomon wrote that. But maybe Solomon collected it and it was in existence for David. But in any event, the imperatives there are never repay evil for evil. If possible, be at peace with all people. Don't take revenge, but leave it up to God. Love your enemy and do good to him. And do not overcome do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so David has kind of violated most of those here. And we saw before that he was willing to leave vengeance up to God. 2 times he had a golden opportunities to kill Saul, but he left that up to God. And another time he was heading over to kill a man named Nabal, but Nabal's wife Abigail met him and convinced him to leave that up to God too. And so those incidents are recorded in 3 successive chapters, 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26. And so, David knew this stuff. Well, here he's been humiliated and he's taking matters into his own hands. And now there were other times when David rightly went to war, but at his best, he consults with God first to see if what he has planned is God's will. And so he would ask God. Sometimes he would have the priest bring out the Urim and Thummim that they used, the Urim and Thummim, and then God would reveal what he wanted David to do. But there's no evidence here that he consulted with God before going to war against Hanun. Well, whatever reason you're going to war, if you're going to go to war, you want to prepare your resources and your strategy and then implement the strategy so the enemy will flee. So you want to be victorious. And so this is in verses 9 to 14. And it says there, now when Joab saw that the battle was set against him at the front and at the rear, he selected warriors from all the choice men in Israel and lined them up against the Arameans. But the remainder of the people he placed under the command of his brother Abishai, and he lined them up against the sons of Ammon. And he said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. For if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, I will come to help you. Be strong and let's show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what is good in his sight. So Joab and the people who were with him advanced to the battle against the Arameans, and they fled from him. When the sons of Ammon saw that the Arameans had fled, they also fled from Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the sons of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. And so remember that Hanun had stationed his army at the entrance to a city and had put the mercenaries in another location out in the field. And so David's general Joab had kind of a two-front battle going on here. And so Joab selected the best warriors and lined them up against the Arameans, the mercenaries, because they were probably the more experienced and better warriors on the other side. And then he lined up the rest of his army against the Ammonites and put his brother Abishai in command of those warriors. And remember, Joab and Abishai are David's nephews. So Joab has his resources in place, and then he comes up with a strategy. If the army he is fighting proves to be too strong, Abishai will help him out. But if the army Abishai is fighting is too strong, Joab will help Abishai. And his plan works. First of all, the Arameans flee, and then the Ammonites flee from Abishai and go back into the city. And so this would have been a walled city, and they went back in and shut the gate, and so they're protected by the wall. And Joab apparently didn't want to lay siege to the city or chase down the Arameans, and so he just returns to Jerusalem. So if you're going to go to battle when something like this happens, you'd better prepare your resources and have a strategy. And I tend to think of litigation when I think of war because I'm an attorney. And I don't do litigation anymore, but I'm familiar with it because I used to do some. And so it can be a difficult decision on whether or not to go into litigation. Usually it's better not, but sometimes you don't really have a choice. For example, someone might be in an abusive situation with their spouse, and so they rightfully must sue for divorce. Well, that can turn into a war, and then they have to fight vigorously in order to get a fair outcome. If you were arrested for a crime you didn't commit, you are going to want to fight the charges. And even if you did do it, you'll want to fight the charges so you don't get railroaded into a worse outcome than is necessary. I've also seen a few family conflicts that kind of fester over the years, and then they escalate when mom and dad die, and it's time to take care of the estate. In those situations, even if someone wins, they end up losing because of the harm to the family can be irreparable. We could think of the current situation in Israel. Israel decided to take the fight to Hamas and to Hezbollah in the north, and they got their resources together and they had a strategy. And so far, it looks like they're winning, if such a thing is possible in actual warfare. So, I think the best policy, whatever the situation you're in, is to pray and ask God what His will is in a situation. And maybe His will is to fight, but maybe it's not. Well, even if we win the battle, our enemy might regroup and prepare to attack again. And that's what we see in 15 to 19, where it says, when the Arameans saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they assembled together. And Hadadezer sent word and brought out Arameans who were beyond the Euphrates River, and they came to Helam. And Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, led them. Now, when it was reported to David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. And the Arameans lined up against David and fought him. But the Arameans fled from Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the kings, servants of Hadadezer, saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the sons of Ammon anymore. And so apparently the Arameans went home, and they felt like they had been humiliated because they lost the little war there at the city of the Ammonites. And so now they have to save face and come together to battle against Israel again. There doesn't seem to be any other reason for them to come to war against Israel. And so they get together after their initial defeat, and they get even more warriors from farther away, from beyond the Euphrates River. And then they go to Helam, which is it's to the north of Israel and on the east side of the Jordan River. And they're getting ready to attack David. Well, when David hears about this, he gets his army together and he goes to Helam. He himself leads the army of Israel this time. And they fight the battle, and David is victorious. And so the Arameans flee from Israel. And it says here in 1 Samuel that David kills 700 charioteers and 40,000 horsemen. And then over in 1 Chronicles, which is a retelling of a lot of these stories, in 1 Chronicles 19:18, it says that David killed 7,000 charioteers. And the 1 Chronicles passage is thought to be more accurate with regard to the numbers here. So it's a decisive victory, and the Arameans make peace with Israel, and they end up serving Israel. They're afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. And so on the surface, David has a great victory over the king who humiliated his messengers when they came to show kindness to him. But it also sets the stage for some problems that we're going to see in upcoming chapters. And so there's going to be times in life when we do something and our motivations are questioned or mischaracterized by others. David wanted to show kindness to King Hanun after his father, Nahash, died because Nahash had been kind to David in the past. And we don't know exactly what that kindness was. Well, Hanun's men say, David's not coming here to honor you. He's coming to spy on the city, and so he can come and overthrow it. And so they humiliate David's men and send them home. Well, that's unacceptable in an honor-based culture, and so David feels like he must respond. And so he sends an army to Hanun's city. Hanun hires mercenaries from Aram bands. Nevertheless, David's army prevails, and Hanun's army goes back inside the walled city and shuts the gate, and the mercenaries flee. And David's army goes home. And so all of this because David sent messengers to show kindness to Hanun, and Hanun humiliated them. Then the mercenaries aren't pleased, and so they call for more reinforcements from beyond the Euphrates River, and they assemble in a town called Helam. Well, David becomes aware of this. The Arameans did it because David had humiliated them in battle, and so now they have to come to preserve their honor. David himself goes with the army this time, and they defeat the Arameans. And so the Arameans make peace with David and end up serving Israel, and they don't fight for the Ammonites anymore. And so it looks like a big victory for David. But we still have the problem of the Ammonites, and this victory kind of sows the seeds of future problems in David's life. And so this is a little bit like my neighbor and the fence problem, except he wasn't trying to do something nice for his neighbor. He could have just walked away and left the fence as it was, or tried harder to work out the problem with his neighbor. It would have been cheaper for him to ask his neighbor, what kind of fence do you want? I will pay for the whole thing. And in our county, there's even a mediation service that will help neighbors work out disputes. So he had a lot of options. He chose just to tear down the fence, and it escalated from there. So when we want to do something, whether it's nice, do something nice for someone, or just to do something, the first thing we should do is check our motives and pray for direction from God. If we proceed, our motives might be misunderstood or mischaracterized, and then we'll need to figure out how to respond. And remember what God says. God says to never repay evil for evil. If possible, be at peace with all people. Don't take revenge, but leave that up to God. Love your enemy and do good for him. And do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, it still might be right to engage in the conflict. And if so, we should prepare our resources and get our strategy ready, and then implement the strategy. And with God's help, the enemy will flee. But if we proceed against God's will or without inquiring of God's will, we might win the war, but we may end up losing the spiritual battle, and we set ourselves up for more trouble in the future. All right, looks like the video was successful this time. It's always good to have a practice round. So I think this second time was a lot better than the first time, or maybe not. But let's have a word of prayer before we sign off. Father, thank you that you have plans for our lives and that you're working those plans out. Thank you for these stories from the Old Testament and what they teach us, how they teach us to live, to follow you, and to rely on you. Pray for all the listeners here that they would listen to your commands and understand that your commands are for our best because you're trying to work out your plan for our life, and we often get in the way. But bless them, guide them in their lives, sanctify us through your word so that we become more and more like Jesus, and save us from getting off track like David did and the consequences that come from that. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks again for tuning in. Most of you, it doesn't make any difference when it comes on because you watch the recorded video. But for the live viewers, thanks for sticking with me today. And hope that you have a great week and that you'll come back next week. So God bless you, and we hope to see you then. Bye-bye.